Hey everybody, welcome back. This is Seth Monahan, Professor of Music Theory, and I'm glad you showed up for video number 18 in my series on classical harmony and counterpoint. Our topic today is doing analysis the right way, and it builds on what we learned in the last two lessons. So if you haven't checked out videos 16 and 17 yet, I'd suggest that you do so just so you get the most out of this one. Now, this may seem weird, but I want to start with an informal cognition experiment, and my reason will be clear in a minute. I'm going to show you a scrambled word for 1 second, and of course I want you to try to unscramble it. Then I'm going to show you the same word again for 1 second, but with two key changes. I'm going to move the actual first letter to the beginning, where it's supposed to be, and I'm going to put the word in some sort of context. And we'll see how this affects your processing speed. So here's the first one. Here's your scrambled word, and here it is in context. Now, I'm willing to bet if you're a native English speaker, you guessed that practice makes perfect. Let's do another one. Here's your scrambled word, and here it is in context. And if my focus groups are right, you spotted that this was the Statue of Liberty. Okay, third one, but now I'm going to change the kind of context I'm giving you. So here's your scrambled word, and here it is in context. Odds are you recognize that it was Beethoven. Last one. Here's your scrambled word. And in context. That one's a little trickier maybe, but a lot of people figured out that that was, in fact, Skywalker. Okay, so why are we doing this? What do we learn? Well, I want you to take away 3 lessons here, and believe it or not, they all have to do with harmonic analysis. The first is that context matters. We learned here that it was way easier to parse a scrambled signal when context provides helpful clues and associations. Now, I know what you might be saying here. Weren't we really just sort of plugging in the missing word and not really unscrambling anything? Well, I'd respond with one more example. So here's your scrambled word, and here's your context. Now, if you're like most people, your brain got zapped there for a second because when I gave you declaration of you were expecting independence, and you didn't get it. You got declaration of backpacking, which of course is not a thing. But there's a lesson here too. Even if your biases aren't always correct, they're still useful because it's easier to confirm or deny what context has led you to expect than it is to always be analyzing everything from scratch. And one reason you were able to make these judgments so quickly was that you knew where to look first. That matters. With the correct first letter in place, your eye knew exactly where to go for the fastest and most efficient analysis. And finally, the third lesson is that multisensory reinforcement matters. In other words, senses other than sight can sometimes help us solve visual puzzles. I gave you 4 musical notes, and you used it to unscramble Beethoven. And 4 more notes helped you unscramble Skywalker. Now, what does all this have to do with harmonic analysis? Well, before I tell you, I want you to think about how students, especially new students, typically do analysis. Here's a really short passage from Beethoven's second Opus 14 piano sonata. And I'm going to analyze the harmonies here like many of my freshmen might, which is to say, tallying all the notes, then finding the root, then figuring out the inversion of every chord from scratch, one at a time. So we start at the beginning. So here's our first chord. So let's say it has a C in it, and then there's a bass clef. Oh, so the notes of the bass clef. G, E, F, C, C, G, F, Wow. Okay, there's a lot not to like here. First of all, this kind of chord-by-chord analysis is inefficient and exhausting. It puts so much time into labeling that there's no time left to look at the big picture or ask important questions about, how the music sounds. And this was just block chords in C major. What happens if we're faced with something serious like Chopin's E-flat minor prelude? We're doomed. Don't even ask. Notice also how unmusical this whole workflow was. We just applied an algorithm and we spit out the labels that we hoped were correct. We didn't listen to the piece. We didn't even need to. But maybe worst of all, we did this with no obvious purpose. I mean, why did we do all this? What did we learn? Did we learn anything about why the passage sounds the way it sounds? Or how we might be able to hear and comprehend it better? Did we pick up any insights that could help us understand the classical style more broadly? Or insights at least we could use next time we look at a passage like this? Doing analysis the right way, I think, means trying to answer all these questions all the time. And it's a process of discovery that lasts a lifetime and gets richer and more rewarding as it goes. So let's see how a pro goes about analyzing a passage like this. Because it's not just a faster version of the chord-by-chord grind we just did. It's really a different perspective. So first and foremost, a pro is going to bring the right tools to the table, which is to say, a knowledge of the Big 18 and of harmonic function. And though they may not know it, they're also going to be helped by the 3 lessons from our cognition experiment. They're going to know where to look first, they're going to use context clues effectively, and they're going to rely on multisensory reinforcement. And I should say up front, I'm going to walk you step by step through a thought process that eventually becomes second nature for a skilled analyst. And that means I'm going to take probably 5 minutes to explain what the trained eye and trained ear can do in like 5 seconds, just to give us a sense of what the goal is here. So let's start with knowing where to look first. A pro knows to look first at the bass line. And I don't just mean the bass note of every chord, I mean the bass line as a whole, as a melody made out of scale degrees. So here's the bass line. And here's the whole texture. And let's analyze the bass line in terms of scale degrees. We have scale degrees 1, 2, 3, 7, 1, 4, 5. Now, since this passage has no accidentals, that means most or maybe even all of its chords are going to come from the Big 18. So let's have that handy as well. Now, you may remember from video 16 that there are some notes in the bass that can't support many chords. So we can make quick, educated guesses with these as to what is above them. I'm referring specifically to scale degrees 1, 3, 5, and 7. So for instance, there are 2 instances of scale degree 1 in the bass. If we look at the top row of the Big 18 grid, we can see that scale degree 1 is typically going to support either root position tonic or a 2-4-2 chord. That's 1 or 2-4-2. But 2-4-2 is much rarer than root position tonic. And it's also bound by a certain counterpoint rule. We're going to learn in a few videos that the bass of any 4-2 chord has to go down by step. And if we look in context, that doesn't happen here. So these are almost surely root position tonic chords, which you can very easily confirm just by playing and listening. That's definitely the sound of the tonic. And second one, also root position tonic. Okay. How about scale degree 3? That's even easier. Look in the 3rd row of the Big 18 grid. Scale degree 3 in the bass only tends to support one chord, 1-6. Look here, and it is definitely the notes of a 1-6 chord, C, E, G. Okay, scale degree 7 in the bass. Bottom row of the chart, scale degree 7 in the bass tends to support either 5-6 or 5-6-5. Both first inversion dominant chords. You look at Beethoven's chord, there's only 3 notes there, B, G, and D, so it can't be a 7th chord, it's a triad. It's 5-6. And then scale degree 5 at the end of the phrase. You remember this can support either a root position dominant, 5 or 5-7, or 1-6-4. But listen to the melody. Melody ends on scale degree 2. Scale degree 2 is not in a 1 chord. That means 1-6-4 is out, and there's only 3 notes in the chord. It's relatively consonant. It's not a dominant 7th. It's just a dominant triad. So that leaves 2 scale degrees, 2 and 4. And these are different because they support a ton of chords. Let's look at scale degree 2 first. This is where context clues come in handy. So when scale degree 2 is in the bass, it could in theory support either a predominant chord, 2-7, or just root position 2, or one of several dominant function chords, okay? But look at the context. This chord is surrounded by tonics, so it can't be a predominant, because if it were, it would go to a dominant. So we know we have a dominant chord here. And if we were listening to the melody, we'd have already arrived at this conclusion because look at the melody. Second chord, has the leading tone in the melody, and that doesn't appear in predominance. So there are a lot of ways we could quickly figure out that this chord is a dominant chord. But which one? Well, count the notes. There's 4 notes. It's a 7th chord. It's 5-4-3. So that leaves us with scale degree 4. And once again, we have a bunch of options. Predominance, there's actually 3 possible predominants, or a dominant, 5-4-2. But think back to video 15. We know that the bass of a 5-4-2 chord, like any 4-2 chord, must resolve down by step. And here, the bass rises by step, which means that it's a predominant chord. And if we tally the notes really quickly, D, F, and A, with a doubled F, it's just a 2 triad. It's a 2-6 chord. So let's listen to the passage again. And speaking of listening, let's move on now to the issue of multisensory reinforcement, the idea that listening itself can make analysis faster and easier. When I'm analyzing, I've always got my ear out for familiar sounds and telltale notes. And in this passage, my ear immediately locks onto the sound of the tonic note going back and forth to the leading tone. We get it first in the melody and then in the bass. So you can hear 1, 7, 1, 7, 1. Those melodic motions tell us something about the harmony. This is probably going to be one of those phrases that starts by going back and forth between tonic and dominant, since you don't get those 1-7, 1-7 motions when predominants are in the mix. Now, on the flip side, I'm also struck by the sound of scale degree 4 going to 5 at the cadence, which, as I mentioned already, is a telltale signature of predominance going to dominance. And in conjunction with this, I'm also noticing that the melody, again, ends on scale degree 2, which is one of the hallmarks of a half cadence. So with all that data, I can very quickly hear 4, 5, predominant, dominant, with a half cadence. Now, I could go on. There's a million other things you could choose to focus your hearing on here, and they're not all harmony per se. There's also just like counterpoint. The outer voice counterpoint here is worthy of a few observations. Suppose we wipe everything clean and just look at the outer voices here. Might be interesting to notice, in terms of the way the passage sounds, that it starts and ends with a bunch of perfect consonances. Octaves, octaves, fifths, and that it connects these with parallel sixths that become parallel thirds when we invert the parts. Underneath all that is a very well-behaved first species example. But we're getting off track here, so let's forget about all that for now. And instead, let me remind you that multisensory reinforcement can include touch as well as sound. As an analyst, the piano is your most important tool. And not just because it lets you make sounds instead of just sitting in silence staring at black dots, although that matters too. The piano is useful because it helps you learn common patterns through motor memory with your fingers. You can internalize things so much more quickly when your ears, your eyes, and your hands are working together. So even if you don't play piano, go tinker when no one's listening, because it makes a huge difference in the long run. Because in the end, it's these common patterns, recognizing common patterns. That's what this is all about. If you're doing more than just slapping labels on chords, if you're paying close attention to how bass lines unfold in time and what harmonic functions they tend to support, you're going to start to see the same short bass line formulas appearing over and over again. I chose this excerpt because it features 3. Scale degree 4 going to 5 in the bass. Scale degree 1 rising to scale degree 3 by step. And scale degree 7 resolving to scale degree 1. So with these patterns in mind, let's go to some other music. Let's have a look at the opening of Beethoven's First Piano Sonata. You might remember this one from video 12 when we talked about musical sentences. So as we listen, follow the bass line and try to find some of these patterns that I've stacked on the right-hand side of the screen. All right, so let's start by analyzing the bass line. Scale degrees. 1, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? And it's pretty easy to see that these patterns are all over the place. We start out on tonic, dipping down to 7 and back. Then 1 rises up to 3 by step. And then 4 goes to 5. Now, okay, so we've recognized the patterns. This doesn't tell us exactly what chord appears over each note. There are going to be some options, but it really streamlines the process. So for instance, when we see the leading tone in the bass between two tonics, we're just wondering about which chord, which dominant appears between them. Same thing when 1 rises to 3. We know it's going to be 1 and 1, 6, which dominant chord is in the middle, and then at the very end, we might be wondering what predominant appears before the dominant 5. And as it happens, we look at that first dominant over scale degree 7. It's got 4 notes, so we can easily spot a 5, 6, 5 there. Moving along scale degree 2 in the bass, there's a 3-note chord here, 7 diminished 6, and then scale degree 4 actually supports a full half diminished 7th chord, 2 half diminished 6, 5. So we got all the harmonies, and then of course the next question to ask is how the harmony relates to everything else that's going on. I'll just point out one interesting feature here. In this particular phrase, you can't ignore the role that rhythm plays in shaping the overall dynamic of the music. So when we listen, I want you to focus on the root position tonic that's right in the middle of the phrase. Notionally, a root position tonic should give us a sense of repose and stability, but the left-hand syncopation prevents it from really feeling like a safe point. So you have a wonderful instance here of rhythm and harmony not quite working together, but instead creating a sort of tension. Have a listen. Here's another example. This is from Beethoven's first piano concerto. So again, we'll listen and then follow the bass line, tracking its scale degrees. All right, so this one unfolds scale degrees 1, 2, 7, 1, 3, 4, 5, 1. And within that bass line, we can see a bunch of our patterns we should be recognizing by now. Scale degree 7 going to 1, which is a dominant in first inversion, going to tonic, and scale degree 4 going to 5, which is going to be a predominant, in this case 2-6, going to a dominant, in this case 5-7. And that knocks out half the chords, and a bunch of the rest are easy. We begin and end on scale degree 1 in the bass. Those are going to be root position tonic chords. You can easily see that they're C major chords. Scale degree 3 in the bass, that's one of our easiest chords because above scale degree 3 we typically only have 1-6. Very easy to see on the page there. So it really leaves only scale degree 2. This is our big variable, and this one, because it goes from tonic to dominant, it could be a predominant or a dominant. But once again, the right hand gives things away. Listen to the melody. Right on the downbeat of scale degree 2, there's the leading tone. That gives the game away because there's no leading tone in predominant chords. So it's a dominant. It happens to be a 5-4-3 chord. We have all 4 notes of the 7th chord there. And as it turns out, this bass line, 1, 2, 7, 1, is its own pattern that we hear over and over and over again in this style. And it's almost always a tonic going to a dominant, and a dominant going to a tonic. So let's listen again. And notice as well, this phrase also has a root position tonic in the middle of the phrase, just like the F minor sonata. But because of the rhythm, because this tonic appears squarely on the downbeat, we don't have any of that tension between rhythm and harmony here. This tonic feels like an absolutely grounded, stable arrival point that launches the second half of the phrase. So have a listen. Now let's take a step back and compare these last two examples in a slightly broader sense. So here's the F minor sonata again, and here's its bass line. With just 2 small tweaks, you take scale degree 2, move it back a few chords, and then tack a tonic on the end, and suddenly we've got the bass line of the piano concerto. And if we zoom out to generalize a little bit, we can see that both of these bass lines follow the same broad pattern. Each of the two phrases begins by alternating tonics and dominants in the lowest part of the scale, lots of scale degrees 1, 7, and 2. And then each of them marches upward by step to the cadential dominant. And this turns out to be an incredibly common scheme, especially at the opening of classical themes. So when I say that analysis hinges on pattern recognition, I'm really talking about patterns on several levels at once here. There are the actual baseline segments that occur over and over again, 1, 7, 1, 1, 2, 3, and things like that. But then there's also what we might think of as broader family resemblances between baselines like these two that are built from the same general archetype. This particular archetype, zigzagging at the bottom of the scale and zooming up to the dominant, is just one, and there are many, many, many others to discover through analysis. So moving on. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is how helpful this kind of analysis can be when we're dealing with busy or complicated textures. Until now, everything we've looked at has been really simple. Just block chords, mostly block chords in the left hand. Everything's in an easy register, clear difference between melody and harmony and so forth. But in the real world, you see pieces that look like this. And if you don't read bass clef very well, this left-hand part is going to be a problem, especially if you're going in and trying to tally every note. But if you're doing things the right way, if you're just extracting the actual bass line and working from there, it's not that hard. Because a trained analyst looks at this and immediately filters out all that clutter, all that noise, and sees just a simple stepwise bass along with a few key melodic notes, probably something like this. So let's listen to Beethoven's original first, and then I'll play you the version that we see with our analyst goggles on, which really makes that stepwise bass line pop. So here's Beethoven. And here's the version that we see with our analyst goggles. And this bass line, big surprise, is made entirely from formulas we already know. So again, rather than analyzing everything from scratch, we're just filling in a few familiar variables. So we've got our 1, 2, 3 progression in the bass line at the beginning. We know it's going to connect a tonic and a 1-6 chord. What chord's in the middle? It's either 7-6 or 5-4-3. Beethoven's got 4 notes in the harmony. It's a 5-4-3 chord. It's a 7th chord. Similarly, we want to spot check that 4-5 in the bass at the end. Turns out in this case, our predominant is just a 4 triad. And because we were very careful listeners, we noticed that there was actually a chord change above scale degree 5 in the bass. So looking at that first chord, we can see pretty clearly it's a 1-6-4. It's got the A flat, C, and E flat in it, with E flat in the bass, and that moves to 5-7. An extremely common pattern we're going to see over and over again. And then, of course, with scale degree 1 at the end, it's going to be a root position tonic. So when we listen now, I want you to track these harmonic changes as they go, but also focus specifically on that 1-6-4 chord. This is a chord we're going to come back to in a few videos, and I want you to notice, just notice when we arrive on the 1-6-4, how unstable the music feels. We could not just stop here. The 1-6-4 doesn't have a tonic function, it has a dominant function. See if you can home in on it. So let's do one more example of a tough texture, and this time it's going to be the right hand that's kind of nasty. Now, if you've been trained to zero in on common bass line patterns, this example from Schubert's E-flat major impromptu is going to be a piece of cake. In fact, the bass line is almost identical to our very first example. Scale degrees 1, 2, 3, 7, 1, 4, 5, and then we tack on 1 at the end. You can even imagine that Beethoven Opus 14 passage in E-flat. But actually, this one sounds like this. So if you were going to try to analyze every chord in this excerpt from scratch with no sense of context or function, you would hit a wall hard in that 4th bar. Notice what the melody's been doing here. on a chordal E flat over 1/6, Schubert moves up the chromatic scale on every compound beat. And every one of those notes is itself embellished by a lower chromatic neighbor. So it creates this kind of chromatic zigzag that fills in all the notes between E flat and A flat. So what's the chord tone in bar 4? Is it F sharp? Do we have some sort of B flat, D, F sharp chord? Is that the chord? It doesn't really sound very Schubertian there. Maybe the chord tone is the G, B flat, and D. At least that sort of spells something we can label. That's a 3-6-4 chord, but that's not a thing in the classical style. But if you know what you're looking for, if you looked at this bass, 1, 2, 3, 7, having 7 in the bass, you know you're looking for a dominant chord, which means you're going to focus immediately on that A flat. That's the chord tone. It's a 5-6-5 chord, even though the chord is actually missing its chordal fifth. There's a missing F here, but that's not going to trouble us because we're going to recognize that sound as the dominant that's definitely going to resolve to tonic on the next downbeat. So the whole progression is 1, 5, 4, 3, 1, 6, 5, 6, 5, 1, 2, 6, 5, 7, 1, and here it is performed again. So I want to wrap up the video with a reality check. Because after the past few lessons, you might be starting to wonder, oh, is every chord in Beethoven and Schubert from the Big 18? That's wishful thinking. Obviously, there are tons of chords we haven't learned yet, and I've basically just been avoiding them to help us focus on what matters. But it's never too soon to start learning how to spot chords that aren't from the Big 18, because they're out there. And in most cases, the giveaway is going to be some chromatic notes, some accidentals from outside the key, because we don't have those in the Big 18. The only accidental we see in the Big 18 is the raised leading tone in minor. So here's the opening of Chopin's F minor nocturne. And on our first listening, track the bass line and just look for patterns that we've seen before. So hopefully you noticed that Chopin's entire bass line here is built from patterns we recognize. We've got 1, 2, 3, 7, 1, 2, 3, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5, 1. But now we're pretending that this is the real world where there's actually no guarantee that this bass line supports Big 18 chords. So let's think about how accidentals might set off certain alarms. We're not worried about the E naturals. Those are the leading tones of the key. We're expecting E naturals. And the B naturals, those are just chromatic neighbor notes embellishing the sustained C naturals. Those B naturals are not chord tones. But have a look at the doubled G flat in the second half of bar 6. That G flat is pretty clearly a chord tone. It's replacing the G natural that we would expect in F minor. So we'd have to slow down and analyze this bar for real. G flat, B flat, and D flat, that's a G flat major triad, and F minor, that's a flat 2 chord in first inversion. That is definitely not from the Big 18. Now, this is one of many chords we're going to learn down the road. This chord actually has a special name. It's called the Neapolitan. But the point is, the G flat's meant that we have to slow down and analyze what the chord actually is. We can't just assume it's one of our Big 18 chords. Now, consider this as well. In minor keys, sometimes it's not accidentals, but the lack of accidentals that should set off alarms, particularly the lack of a leading tone. Let's zoom in on Chopin's first 2 bars here. The bass line here is 1, 2, 3, 7, which then goes to 1 in the next bar. And for the last 20 minutes, I've been training you to make certain assumptions when you see a rising 1, 2, 3 bass line. I've told you to assume it's going to support tonic, one of 2 dominant chords, and then tonic again in first inversion. Let's see if this is actually right. So the first chord, this checks out. We've got F, A flat, and C. The second one should be E, G, and B flat, and maybe a C natural if it's a 5-4-3 chord. But that's not what's here. There's no C, and more importantly, scale degree 7 is not raised. There is no E natural. Instead, we've got E flat, the E flat from the natural minor scale. So this can't be either of those dominant chords we were expecting. And then look at the chord above scale degree 3. It's got A flat and C, but no F. And there's no such thing as a tonic chord without the tonic in it. In video 16, remember we learned that the only note you can leave out of a triad is its fifth. That means the missing note here is actually E flat, and that what we're hearing is an incomplete A flat major triad. So what do we have here? In terms of sheer labeling, this second chord is either a 7-6, or if we count the D flat, a 7-6-5. And notice that this is the uppercase 7 Roman numeral, which tells us that the chord's root is not the leading tone, but the subtonic, the lowered 7th degree. And then the third chord is a root position 3 chord. And neither of these, 7 or 3, is in the big 18. And I'll tell you why. Listen to the second and third chords again, but this time just without the opening tonic. If I just played you that with no context, you'd say, oh, that's dominant going to tonic in A flat major. 5-6-5 going to 1. 7-1. But when we put it back into context, I don't think that impression goes away entirely. So with the right kind of focus, I think you can hear this passage starting in F minor, but then drifting briefly toward A flat, the relative major, and then finally getting yanked back into F minor when the leading tone appears in the bass. So F minor, moving into A flat major, and then back to F minor again. And if you have trouble hearing this, try comparing this to a recomposed version that stays totally in F minor. So this would be the version that gets rid of 7 and 3 and replaces them with the chords we expected from the big 18. So hopefully you can hear how that progression is very different from... So this, ultimately, is why chords containing the subtonic don't have any place in the big 18. It's just too easy for them to weaken our sense of key and pull us toward the relative major. Of course, they're really useful if you actually want to modulate to the relative major, which is a piece of cake in minor, but that's the stuff of another video. So let me just wrap up for now with a bit of congratulations. You made it all the way to the end. This is a long video, but its lessons are some of the most important ones in the whole series, so I hope you took them to heart, and I'll see you next time around.